Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you. Thank you all. Be seated. Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you. Okay, that's enough. Laura and I want to welcome you. Ken Hirsch and wife Julie, who's the new president and CEO of the Bush Center, and all of us who work here are thrilled you're here. I must confess I've got mixed emotions. One, I'm thrilled to be a part of this. Two, I'm very disappointed that you're not here to give me the Pulitzer for the book I wrote. By the way, every good organization needs a Pulitzer Prize recipient on their staff. And here at the Bush Center, we have one in Bill McKenzie, and we're fortunate that Bill is a part of our team. Kevin Ann, thank you very much for convincing us to join you in hosting this. It's very exciting for the Bush Center that you're here, and all the members of the Pulitzer Prize Board, as well as the representatives from 41's library, and I forgot LBJ's number. Anyway, looking forward to the performances that'll take place here in a little bit. And as a history buff, I'm thrilled that Annette Gordon-Reed, Ron Chernow, and John Meacham are here to be interviewed by Mark Updegrove. At any rate, in order to get my book reconsidered, I thought I would share an anecdote with you. So I was tasked it didn't require much tasking, by the way, to talk to Vladimir Putin about the necessities to have a free press in order for the society to be a wholesome and vibrant society. He had just suspended the independent press, and this was in Slovakia. I couldn't identify it during the debates. Anyway, so I said, Vladimir, really important that if you want to join those of us who realize the benefits of a free society, that you have a vibrant press. And he looked at me and said, you're a hypocrite. You fired the famous newsman. It kind of took me aback. And I said, what the hell are you talking about, man? He said, you know what I'm talking about. You fired the newsman. I said, you talking about Dan Rather? He said, yeah. I said, what you don't understand, Vladimir, is that in our society, the press is independent from the politicians, as it should be. The job of the press in a free society is to hold people who've got power to account. And you're going to need that if you're going to have a vibrant society. And I said, whatever you do at the press conference that we're about to have, make sure you don't say that I fired the famous newsman, because the people in our country are going to think you're ignorant, that you don't know what you're talking about. So sure enough, we have the press conference. First question, Moscow Times. Mr. President Putin, did President Bush talk to you about a free press in Russia? And if so, did you bring up the fact that he fired the famous newsman? At any rate, I want to thank the press for what you do. And my relationship with the press was cordial, because I understand the symbiotic relationship. You need me, and I needed you. And it was I really don't miss much about Washington. But I will tell you that the intellectual stimulation from dealing with a vibrant and free press was a very important part of the job. At any rate, thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Please welcome Vice President and Editorial Page Editor of the Dallas Morning News and Pulitzer Prize Board Co-Chair, Kevin Ann Willey.
Thank you, President Bush and Mrs. Bush, for hosting us here tonight. This is truly a lovely venue, and we're honored that you're sharing it with us. Good evening, and welcome to the Pulitzer Prize Centennial celebration in Dallas. This event is actually one of 4 national marquees this year in collaboration with the Pulitzer Prize Board. The other marquee events so far have been in St. Petersburg, Florida. That one was focused on the voices of social justice and equality. And in Los Angeles. That one was focused on war, migration, and the quest for peace. The last marquee event this year will be in Boston in September. Its title is Power, Accountability, and Abuse. But we're here today in Dallas. The inherent tension between presidents and the people who elect them has produced some of the country's most important journalism, scholarship, and art. This 2-day marquee is titled The People, the Presidency, and the Press, and it will showcase, examine, and discuss some of the best of that work. The goal of all of these symposia is to establish and enrich conversation around the values embodied by the Pulitzer Prizes, and to deepen the public discourse about the value of journalism, literary arts, and the humanities to our democracy. This event is also one of hundreds of Centennial events hosted by groups across the country. The Pulitzer Board has partnered with the Federation of State Humanities Councils in 46 states and territories in a $1.7 million project funded by the Pulitzer Board, the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Each of these humanities councils is hosting multiple Centennial events. These more localized events, which we've nicknamed campfire initiatives in the interest of fanning the flames of light and passion, range in scope from book fairs and poetry slams and journalism workshops to musical ensembles, panel discussions, and drama readings. They are occurring throughout the year from Oregon to Georgia, Arizona to Maine. The marquees and the campfires are all designed to highlight the first 100 years of the Pulitzer Prizes and to inspire new audiences for the next 100 years around the values that undergird them. Those values include unstinting fact-finding, well-researched analysis, lucid writing, rigorous self-reflection, cultural discovery, and public service. And now, as we launch into our program tonight, I have one housekeeping note to make, and that is just to ask you to remember to use the hashtag Pulitzer100 if you tweet or Instagram or anything else on social media from this event. Now, the Pulitzer Prizes are awarded each year in 5 book categories, 14 journalism categories, music, and drama. Let me emphasize that last category for a moment, drama. Let's begin the evening with a focus on 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning dramas having to do with American politics and the presidency. We'll start with a couple of flashes from the past, which seem uncannily relevant today, and then fast forward to a present-day presentation. So to guide us on this whirlwind tour, let me introduce to you the talented actors of the Dallas Theater Center. Well, thank you, Dallas Theater Center. What a wonderful sweep through some of the best American dramas about presidency and political power. Special thanks to actors Sarah Elizabeth Price, Matt Ransdell, Shambry Ferguson, James Crawford, Michael Connolly, Alex Organ, Connor Palmore, stage manager Wendy Eastland, and accompanist Vonda Bowling. Thank you very much. Well, now seems a good opportunity to let you know that the program tonight and tomorrow is a result of an unusual collaboration among 5 different organizations. I'd like to take just a minute here to thank the leaders of these organizations, some of whom have been working on this program for more than a year. As I call your names, please stand to be recognized as a collaborating group. Let's all hold our applause if we can until we get them all standing. From the Pulitzer Board, I'd like to recognize my fellow board co-chairs, Joyce Daly, former vice president for news at Lee Newspapers, and Randall Beck, retired publisher and executive editor of the Argus Leader of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. From the Dallas Morning News, which has won 9 Pulitzer Prizes in categories ranging from photography to national reporting to editorial writing, we have Mike Wilson. From Austin, we have Amy Barbie, Executive Director of the LBJ Foundation. From College Station, we have Fred McClure, former CEO and current board member of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation. And from the Bush Center here in Dallas, we have Ken Hirsch, President and CEO, and of course, Bill McKenzie, who is the editorial director of the Bush Institute, and as you heard earlier, a Pulitzer Prize winner. Please join me in welcoming these people and thanking them and their organizations. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask all the Pulitzer Prize winners with us tonight to stand and be recognized for their great work. But first, I'd like to recognize one winner in particular whose work has special relevance to the theme of this 2-day marquee, The People, the Presidency, and the Press. Think back to 1963 and a remarkably composed photograph that crystallized a historic moment. Actually, there were 2 remarkable photos. The one by Dallas Times Herald photographer Bob Jackson was snapped a fraction of a second later than the one by the Dallas Morning News photographer. And as a result, it captured the grimace on Lee Harvey Oswald's face as the bullet from Jack Ruby's gun penetrated Oswald's gut. To quote the Denver Post in a story about the prize-winning photograph, Jackson's photo has maintained the command that photojournalism always has and still does, the capability of telling a full story by freezing time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Bob Jackson, who flew in from his home in Colorado to be with us here tonight. And now I'd like to ask all the Pulitzer Prize winners who are with us here tonight to stand and be recognized for their great work. Steve Benson, please remain standing for a moment. Steve is a prize-winning editorial cartoonist for the Arizona Republic in Phoenix, and a witty and prolific spot cartoonist who will be covering these events over the next couple of days, and some of you as well. Little known fact about Steve, he's a graduate of Richardson High School right here in North Texas. So please take an opportunity to introduce yourself to Steve during the intermissions tonight and tomorrow, at lunch tomorrow, and take a look at the cache of sketches that he will be developing throughout the program.
Thanks for the material.
And now it's my pleasure to invite the President and CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center to the podium to introduce our first panel discussion, Mr. Ken Hirsch.
Thank you very much, Kevin. The performance of
from the Dallas Theater Center. I want to thank Joel Farrell, who is the Associate Artistic Director of the Dallas Theater Center, and all the great performers for that treat. I also have to thank the charming, witty, beautiful, intelligent board chair of the Dallas Theater Center, Julie Hirsch, who's also here tonight, who had absolutely nothing to do with the performance, but we absolutely have to recognize her for her attendance this evening. I was born at night, but not last night. So the Bush Center is a special place. This is my first week on the job, so it's a little bit humbling to present tonight a very, very humbling panel. But before I do, I want to thank even more than the Pulitzer Prize, or as much as the Pulitzer Prize winners who are with us tonight, the absolute wonderful public servants who have helped and served this country in so many different capacities. I want to welcome and thank for being here Haley Barbour, the former governor of Mississippi, General Michael Hayden, the former director of the NSA and the CIA under President Bush, Secretary Leon Panetta, the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, and Ambassador Mark Langdale, who's also on the board of the Bush Presidential Center. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for your service. Through this event, the Pulitzer Prizes mark historical significant work and recognize great contributions that helped tell the past and shape the future. Here at the Bush Center, we think about that every day. The mission of the Bush Center is to motivate, it's to develop leaders, it's to foster policy and take action. And we do that around key areas like economic growth, education reform, human freedom and democracy, women's empowerment, military service and wellness and transition. And understand that what our job here is to use the power of this platform to convene, to amplify, and to make an impact on very, very important issues of the day. And it's served that purpose, and my role is to help build connections between that mission and the broader communities, the communities of Dallas, of SMU, of Texas, of the United States, and the world. It is a humbling task, but in the first week, it's an absolutely fantastic one. And so thank you all for helping me start this journey. Of course, when we study the past, the presidents have a lot to do with it. And we're honored today to have some of the most esteemed voices join in telling and describing the history of what the presidency and the press are all about. And as President Bush said, the strong press is not, and a free press is not something that we talk about only in emerging economies. It's something that's very, very vital to the very foundation of our democracy. So to have this great panel is a real, real pleasure, and I'd invite them out on the stage now as I introduce them. Ron Chernow is one of the most distinguished commentators of history, politics, business, and finance in America today. His book, Washington, A Life, won the Pulitzer Prize in biography in 2011. In 2009, Mr. Chernow has worked with Lin-Manuel Miranda on the Pulitzer Prize-winning Broadway musical Hamilton, which was inspired by his biography of Alexander Hamilton. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 for The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family. Her forthcoming book, The Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination, we all look forward to. John Meacham is a presidential historian, contributing editor at Time, and executive vice president and executive editor at Random House. His book, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, won the Pulitzer Prize in biography in 2009. Most significant to this audience may be his just published book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. And our moderator, Mark Updegrove, is the director of the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin and author of 4 books on the presidency. He's an analyst for ABC News on matters relating to our politics and the presidency, and he's written for countless publications. Thanks to each of you in attendance for making this a very, very special evening and a special event today and tomorrow. And please welcome our panelists to discuss presidential biographies, the challenges then and now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and congratulations on your appointment. Well, it's a pleasure to moderate this panel with this illustrious group. And we'll start with the presidential icons like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln. And that's pretty well-trodden territory for biographers. For Washington alone, there are 900 biographies, full-fledged biographies. So I'll ask each of you, when you're tackling a mammoth subject like a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson or an Andrew Jackson, where do you start? Now, John, let's start with you.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Pick on me. Well, first of all, I was misinformed. It's like Casablanca. I didn't know there were other books about it. So I called Annette. She didn't tell me. Yeah. So that was kind of upsetting. I have two tests. One is, do I feel that there is a place in the scholarly and popular conversation for an argument about that person? And in fact, this is wonderful that we're here with Ron, because one of the reasons I wrote about Jefferson was that Ron had kind of surrounded Jefferson, both from Hamilton and from Washington's perspective. Our friend David McCullough had done John Adams, and I think Jefferson was sort of, had been more of a foil and more of a supporting character in the broad historiography of the last decade or so. And so I thought there was a place to talk about Jefferson on his own terms. And then I always try, as we all do, to make as much use of archives and new archives as you can, so you can justify a new look.
What about you, Annette? Where do you start?
Well, every generation of historians asks different questions about the subject, and Jefferson, I think, is the most interesting man in the world. I mean, there are so many aspects of his life, and we've learned so much more about him. Slavery at Monticello, his political life, and so forth. So there was a life to be rediscovered from a lot of the information that had always been present, but had never been looked at. So there are always new things about Jefferson because there were so many aspects to his life. It's not just the politics. It could be music, it could be art, it could be all kinds of things. And because of the Declaration of Independence, it's a continuing story in the American saga. Every generation, every group of people who tries to make their place in the American nation uses the Declaration. People around the world do it. So it's endlessly, it's a font of information, font of questions. So it was no question for me at all about whether or not there's something to say about him, because we ask different questions depending upon the answers that we want to have today.
Right about. Ron, what about you? I mentioned 900 full-scale biographies of George Washington. Do you read them? Where did you start in tackling
Well, I have to say, Mark, that a lot of my so-called friends kept asking me why I wanted to perpetrate number 901 on the world, and was that really necessary? You know, I think that you do a biography either because you have new information or you feel that you can really do a fresh portrait of the person. And I had this epiphany when I was working on Hamilton. There came a moment during the Revolutionary War when Hamilton, who was Washington's aide-de-camp, had a feud with Washington. And Hamilton realized that he had to justify this decision to quit Washington's staff. He realized he had to justify this decision to his father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, who was a very close friend of Washington. So he sat down, he wrote a letter to his father-in-law that said, "The great man and I have come to an open rupture. He shall, for once at least, repent of his ill humor." And I remember that line, "he shall for once at least repent of his ill humor," kept reverberating in my mind, because I had this image of the saintly George Washington, and suddenly here Hamilton is giving me the sense of this volatile powder keg boss. And Hamilton tended to pen very kind of perceptive word portraits of people. He'd been working with Washington every day for several years at that time. And so I thought to myself, Washington, seemingly the most familiar person in our history, could it be that he was the most unfamiliar in some way? And that was my opening wedge, and it kind of pried open for me a whole world into his inner emotions, which were very intense and very volatile, because he was always seen as this kind of man of marble, a stolid, phlegmatic person, and he wasn't at all.
Ron, when we talked prior to this conversation, you said something that stuck with me. You said, great figures in history can carry the weight of their flaws. So how do you ensure when you're writing about those great figures that you're presenting a balanced portrait?
Well, you know, I find that as I go on with the biography, particularly if I feel that this is going to be an admiring biography, I go out of my way, Mark, to put every unpleasant fact about the character in the book. I mean, my greatest fear is either a reader or a viewer saying, of course, Chernow came up with an admiring portrait of Hamilton. He didn't mention A, B, C, and D. I want to make sure that A, B, C, and D are in there. And I find that if it really is a great figure, he or she will be able to carry the weight of their defects. And one very interesting thing that happened with the Hamilton show, there were a lot of Broadway producers who said to us, the protagonist of a Broadway musical has to be sympathetic throughout the show. Of course, Hamilton, particularly in the second act of the show, really tests the sympathy of the audience. He's involved in a sex scandal. He encourages his son to go off on a duel in which his son dies. So all sorts of flaws are shown. But you know, what I discovered watching the audience reaction is that they ended paradoxically having even more admiration for him because we had humanized him. Mm-hmm. And I had the same experience when I finished the Washington biography. I sent a copy down to Jim Reese, who was then the president of Mount Vernon. And I said, Jim, before you read this, I just want to tell you that 150 pages into this, you may feel that this is kind of a very negative portrait of George Washington. Washington, when he was young, he was often rather crass and pushy and money conscious and status conscious. And I tried to have all of that in there. And Jim wrote back a very, very thoughtful letter to me. And he said, Ron, I'm so glad that you were completely unsparing in this warts and all portrait of Washington, because he said the main problem we have with the 1 million+ people who come to Mount Vernon every year, he seems like a plaster saint, and hence unreal, and hence boring. That the most important thing is to humanize them, and I think that when you humanize someone, then their accomplishments actually seem that much greater, because the reader can identify with this character as a person who has the same sorts of problems that they did.
Right.
And if you care about the person, I mean, I became interested in Jefferson when I was in the 3rd grade in Conroe, Texas. I'm a Texan, I should say. And shameless applause. Applause. If you really care about the person, I mean, there's no reason to write, for me, to write something that's not real or not realistic. And if you care about the individual and you think that that person's life says something to an audience and it's worth spending your time working on, there's no point in doing a rosy, an unrealistic picture. You want everything there in order to take the measure of the person. You have to have the necessary sympathy. That doesn't mean that you gloss over anything, but it does mean that you try to see the world through that person's perspective and to bring that perspective to your reader. So if you're really serious about it and you really care about the person and the readers, and that's the thing that has motivated me to write about Jefferson and to study about Jefferson, and to put it out there in a realistic way. I mean, you have to have warts and all.
So look, just quick,
please.
As a Jackson biographer, I don't have this problem. We're just trying to get to the skin next to the wart. My guys had a tough couple of months.
Tough few years, actually. Couple of decades.
Chernow gets the musical and the $10 bill. My guy didn't even get the $1 bill anymore, $20 bill anymore. But I think that the reason I did Jackson to some extent was I do think in the popular imagination, people tend to go from the founding to Lincoln pretty quickly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's it's kind of a big period there.
Sure.
And
then right to TR.
You
have another dry
And he
period,
did
right?
have an age. There was an age of Jackson.
Exactly. The only president who had, better for worse, the only president who has a name, an era named for him.
Right.
And I think one of the watch it. Just because you're the most honored person in the world does not mean. I carry a sedan chair for Annette wherever we go. At Monticello, there's actually just a whole room devoted to It's kind of embarrassing for all of us. But not since Annette Gordon-Reed dined alone has there been. But Jackson embodied, I think, some of our best instincts and our worst. And if you don't deal with Jackson, you can't deal with antebellum America, because he may have been on the extreme edge of the mainstream on the two central sins of American life, African American slavery and Native American removal, but he was within the mainstream. And that may be uncomfortable to talk about, but it is true. Nobody ever went back and reopened the question of Native American removal. Right. Congress never revisited it. And his devotion, I believe, to the Union in putting down John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, as ever, was causing problems early. In order to keep the Union together, it gave us 30 more years to form those mystic chords of memory. And so if you don't deal with Jackson, I don't think you can deal with the American soul, both in its light and dark elements. The other thing I'll say just in general is, my own sense is, we learn more from the past if we look it in the eye than if we look up at it adoringly or down on it condescendingly.
So let me relate a quote from Mark Twain, who said, "What a wee part of a person's life is his acts and his words. All day long the mill of his brain is grinding, and his thoughts, not those of other things, are his history." So when you're tackling a biographical subject, you have to make inferences about their mindset, about their motivation. How does one responsibly introduce psychology into biography?
Well, I think it's necessary. I mean, there was a biographer, Fawn Brodie, who got into trouble for writing a biography of Jefferson and calling it a psychohistory, but all biographers are doing that. You're getting into the mindset of the person and trying to, I mean, actually the book Most Blessed of the Patriarchs is out now, and it's actually out there in the hallway. And what we're trying to do, my co-author Peter Onuf and I, is to be responsible in reading Jefferson's words, looking at his actions, and as you say, make inferences about that, and sort of patterns that you discern help you see what the person was attempting to do in the world. But you can't, I don't think it's possible to present a picture of a subject without trying to get into their mind. That's all biographers do it, whether they say they're doing psychology or not, they are psychoanalyzing people.
I mean, Emerson said there's properly no history, only biography. So, yes, I mean, there's no reason. Ron had the image of painting a portrait, and Ron's wonderful Washington book leads with Gilbert Stuart's impression of painting Washington. But if you don't practice psychiatry without a license, you should find another line of work, I think.
I think that there has to be psychological understanding at the center of any biographical portrait. But I think what's very important in general in biography is not to introduce anachronism, because I think what we love about biography should cast a spell. There should be an enchantment as we're transported back into the past and recreating this world. And I think that to introduce modern psychological jargon has a way of breaking that spell. It's kind of like the present suddenly invades the past. And I think that there's another problem with introducing modern psychological terminology, which is very often, if the word didn't exist, the phenomenon that it's describing may not have existed. So for instance, I mean, if Sigmund Freud wrote about, hysteria in Victorian women, I don't want to introduce the term hysteria in writing about the 18th century, because it may be, not only is the term foreign, but it may have been that the phenomenon was foreign. In fact, a lot of people said maybe it wasn't even happening, in Freud's Vienna. So I think that one has to use psychological insights, but without the whole kind of paraphernalia of modern psychology.
I mean, jargon is typically wrong or problematic.
Yeah. And
So define that, Ron. Define paraphernalia. What do you mean?
Well, if I suddenly, start saying George Washington had an Oedipus complex or
Right.
something, that not only immediately shatters the mood, but you have to figure out a way of analyzing the character that's true to the period. And one of the things that is, I think, makes it difficult to write about the 18th century is that people were not introspective in the way that they became, particularly, I think, starting in the mid-19th century. People were not analyzing their own psyches. I mean, I found it amazing.
John Adams did.
Adams, of course, yeah. Adams was in many ways the most interesting mind in that way, but having spent 11 or 12 years with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, two men who were so extraordinarily bright never seemed to kind of turn the searchlight of their intelligence on themselves. And so when they revealed themselves, they have a way of kind of inadvertently revealing themselves. I'll just give one small example with George Washington. Washington, everyone noticed Washington had this poker face. It was very, very difficult to read his emotions. And I found myself wondering, was this accidental or deliberate? And during his second term, as he was approaching the end of his second term, the British ambassador said to him, General, I can see in your face your happiness that you were approaching the end of your second term. And Washington shot back and said, sir, my face never reveals my emotions. It was interesting that he corrected someone for suggesting that he had revealed his emotions. And, we're so different because we almost pride ourselves now on showing emotion. And I think in the 18th century, we would consider silence, like if you've had a troubled childhood and you never want to talk about it, that's a sign of a lack of mental health. Whereas in the 18th century, that was considered a sign of strength, that you were not constantly stewing about what your mother, did to you when you were 5 years old. So it's a very, very different world, and it's not an easy problem to deal with.
I have a theory which I've never been able to prove, which is the best kind. That's why it's a theory. But not only on the psychological detail in letters from the 18th and 19th century, but the narrative details. You can see a shift from the founding to the Jackson era into the Lincoln era,
Absolutely.
where suddenly people start narrating scenes. The distinction between the Jefferson era in doing this and the Jackson era is quite fascinating. And I think it's partly attributable to the rise of the novel. I think people started reading novels and started seeing themselves in more narrative terms.
And people and women began to keep diaries in ways that they had not before. And so that is, for the female side of it, storytelling and the narrative becomes much more important.
I mean, it's a very good point, because I found when I started doing Washington, we probably have at least 1,000 descriptions, first-hand descriptions of Washington left by different people. And I found them always very, very frustrating, because someone would say, I had dinner with the general last night. I've never felt such awe and veneration, in the presence of men. And of course, as the biographer, you're looking for the small change of everyday life. You're kind of looking for the details that will make the person come alive. Whereas the 18th century, and you could see this if you read Alexander Pope, I mean, it was part of English literature in the 18th century. The language, by our standards, is very, very abstract. And then as the 19th century goes on, not only is there more of this psychological awareness, but there's more of that kind of sensory detail, descriptive detail. I've gone from writing Hamilton, Washington, now I'm doing Ulysses S. Grant, and I feel like, I died and went to heaven, because when people described Grant, described the way he looked, the way that he moved, the way that he sounded. And I find that compared to writing, and I did the best I could with Washington and Hamilton, but I feel with Grant that I'll be able to evoke this personality in a way that would have been almost impossible with an 18th century figure. The reminiscences are so much more colorful and detailed and anecdotal. Now, there were some, and you mentioned that John Adams, John Adams did have almost kind of novelist's mind, and all sorts of things would pop out of his, not just conscious, but unconscious mind. But the others were very, very Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, Jay, very controlled.
Yeah. Well, it's much better. It's wonderful that Jefferson had grandchildren
Yeah.
from the 19th century, because then you began to get, I mean, Monticello, the papers of Thomas Jefferson have something called the Family Letters Project,
Yeah.
and so they're collecting a lot of the letters from his grandchildren, and so many of the things that happened, you know, in the 1790s or when he's in France or other places, you get descriptions of him that are from his grandchildren. Or there's one episode when
Yeah.
he's in Poplar Forest and his manservant, Burl Colbert, falls ill, and he becomes frantic about it. And he ends up writing a letter to his daughter saying, you know, Burl we almost lost him, but he's fine now. There's like 2 lines. But his granddaughters are writing to their mother, and they're talking about him just pacing, being frantic, waiting for the doctor. He really didn't like doctors, but if you just read Jefferson's letter, you'd say this was like a non-episode. But the people, his grandchildren, writing to their mother, just, you know, sort of depict this person who's completely undone by the possibility. They say, I don't know what's going to happen if Burl dies. We wake up and Burl is dead. But you would never get that from him, because everything is understatement. And that was the goal. That was the presentation you were supposed to have.
I was talking to Doris Kearns Goodwin, herself a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer, last month. And we were talking about how she selects the subjects that she takes on. And she said, I think about the person I want to live with for the next 7 years. And you really do. You have to, particularly when you're looking back in time, you have to immerse yourself in their times. And you really do have to, in so many ways, live with them. So is it important that you like the subject that you're tackling, or at least that you relate to them?
I think so. I wouldn't want to spend 5, 6, 7, 8 years with someone I disliked, despite several relationships I've had through the years. Which means absolutely nothing. I thought I'd throw that out there. You know, there are biographers, particularly multi-volume biographers, who I think have an advantage in the multi-volume world, where you can disapprove, but then redeem the character. I won't mention who that is, but you work closely.
Sure.
Just to pick an example at random. But I don't think it's. I mean, the line is hagiography versus trying to be honest. And what I find, and I would love to know if you all have this, is I have this sort of gut check toward the end of each project, where I think, is this as true as I can make it? Not that it's totally true, but is it as true as I can do? And I believe that I feel a moral obligation, not to get too gooey about it, but a moral obligation to say, despite what, you know, critics may say it's too positive, some may say I was too hard on this or that, but do I believe this? And I just went through this with President Bush Sr., who I believe, honestly, most political figures are kind of 60-40 light versus dark. It's kind of the nature of the game. I honestly believe that George H.W. Bush is more like 80-20.
Yeah.
That's my view, having spent, depending on how you count on it, 17 years thinking about doing the book, 6 years of interviewing him, dealing with, you know, a diary that he kept weekly, more times, several times a week as president. He was not perfect. He will admit that. But taken all in all, I think there was more light than dark, significantly more light than dark. And so that was as true as I could make it. And I think sometimes if you're writing with the critic on your shoulder, I think that way madness lies. I really do. I think that it's just, and you know, if you're always worried about what the toughest critic is going to say, I don't know how you finish.
Yeah. I mean, what are the impulses for doing? Well, the Hemingses are different because that's a family biography, and there are people in the family that you like more than the others. And at some point, there are things that they're doing or not doing that you could get exasperated with. But obviously, I had a great amount of sympathy for the family, the totality of the family, an enslaved family, and the circumstances that they were in. Jefferson, as I said, this has been, you know, a big part of my life. Looking at Jefferson, reading about Jefferson and slavery at Monticello and his life as a political figure. And like him, I like him very much as a subject, and I don't think that he was a malicious person. I think he was a very interesting person and a life that's worth studying. But I think one of the impulses, the impetus for doing Most Blessed of the Patriarchs is that we've kind of gotten tired of Jefferson writing where people are basically the critic that you're saying, that yours is not like that, where it's basically, I'm going to show him how much better I am than he is, and I understand this, and he doesn't understand all of that. And the book is really about what Jefferson thought he was doing in the world, not what we thought he should be doing in the world. And I think if you do that, if it's all this sort of, as you say, a running catalog of, well, I know this and you don't, I know this and you don't, and I'm better than you are in this, instead of, what did you think you were doing? There was this person who sort of injected himself onto the public stage and had the confidence, arrogance, whatever you wanted to call it, to think that he could be a leader, and had some conflicts about that, didn't like controversy, did not like conflict, but nevertheless entered a very confrontational and conflict-ridden profession. What was this about? Who was this person? And so that, if you keep that in mind, instead of, the hammer of, the vengeance, that you're going to wreak havoc on this person because you think you're better than he or she is, then that's a problem. I did do a tiny biography of Andrew Johnson,
Right.
which I didn't like him. It was a one-off. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. asked me to do the president, the American President series. It's 40,000 words. It's a short thing. I thought, I can venture into that. It's okay, but I didn't like him. I would not want to spend 7 minutes with him. More or less, 7 years.
Yeah.
Thankfully, it was a short book.
It's a short book. But I'm saying that.
Short presidency.
But he was an enormously important person. He was a pivotal president. And so it's not, so you have to get back, there you have to step back from the like and dislike and think about why every American should know about him, because this was an era of missed opportunities. A lot of the things that we're dealing with now, we might not have been dealing with if he had been a different man. And so it's not about, who your best BFF, your bestest friend. It's, who and how did they affect the progress of the American nation, and there's no question that he did. So he's worth knowing about, whether he was a pleasant person or not.
Yeah. I find that I spend more time thinking about who will be the subject of a book than any other question. I spend months agonizing over that, because whenever I speak to writing students about this, I always say that writing a biography is a lot like marriage. If you pick the right person, nothing can go wrong. If you pick the wrong person, nothing can go right. You were trapped with this person for many years. I think that if someone writes a biography, and this often happens because they've always loved this person, you run the risk of it being a Valentine, which is not good. Also, if someone writes a biography because they want to get someone, they don't like it, very often it can end up with an ugly tone. So I think that one should start out with the presumption that this will be, a favorable book. I think it's very, very unfair to start out with the presumption that this is going to be, a hostile portrait of the person. But, it's interesting. I think that, and I'm sure that John and Ned have the identical experience. The single most frequently asked question by readers is, like I'm doing U.S. Grant now, so do you like Grant, Ron? And I can honestly say I'm not sitting there day after day thinking, would I like to have a beer with U.S. Grant? For
He would have
me.
liked to have a beer.
Well, that actually might have been with Grant. I'm sorry, that could have been an interesting experience. Would have told me a lot. Thank you, John. But for me, I always loved the portraits of the old masters. And when I look at a portrait by a Rembrandt or a Titian or a Velázquez of a king or a queen, a great merchant or a pope, they weren't sitting there thinking, do I like this person? they were, one, trying to capture this person as vividly as they can and kind of bring this person so vividly to life that the viewer would, that all sorts of feelings would be evoked in the viewer, in the same way that in real life we don't have one view of a friend or a family member or an acquaintance. We have kind of many different views of them. And I think that if the portrait of the person's biography is real enough, I think the reader should end up having a rather kind of complicated feeling about the person.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Because you two are different in the sense that play the role of, well, I wrote a biography of Johnson, as I said, as sort of a one-off. But I'm not really interested in writing about anybody else other than Jefferson or Monticello-related things. And what is it like writing about wildly different people in different eras? Because I'm fairly sure I'll never write a biography of anybody else that's not related to Jefferson or Hemings or something. And the biography of Hemings is, in a way, almost like a biography of Jefferson. So I'm not, you guys play around. I don't.
Excellent question.
You're promiscuous biographers.
I protest.
Do you want to go first?
I protest. Ron may not protest. Well, that's what's fun. I'm sure monogamy is great. Is this taped? Jesus. No, to me, it's what's fascinating. What draws me to subjects is their complexity. I'm not trying to write books so people will build statues of people. Most of the people I write books about, they're taking them down, for Christ's sake. So obviously I'm not very successful, if that's my goal. But I think that, to me, the perennial human drama is the people I write about are flawed human beings who have sought power over the lives of others. And to what extent, what drove them to seek that power, and then how did they wield it, and to what effect?
Okay.
Let me follow up on that.
Whoa. I got the monogamy question.
I think it's an excellent question. I think the most difficult aspect of jumping around, I think it's more difficult to jump around different periods than just different personalities. Because now I'm doing U.S. Grant, and so I've had to master the Mexican War, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil War and Reconstruction. The literature is so vast. I feel like I'm out on the North Atlantic on a stormy day in a very tiny rowboat sometimes. So that's the difficulty, that you're kind of creating the foundation of knowledge from the ground up, indescribably difficult. What is fun, the way is easier, is that, the way that you're in a new country and your senses come alive. In a way, suddenly being in a new period with new characters, that you're very, very responsive. So I think that maybe if I'd spent my entire career not just with Grant, but Sherman and Sheridan, Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, all of these different characters, I think that my reactions would not be as strong as they are, because not that I was unfamiliar with these people before, but I'm learning them on an entirely different level, writing a biography about Grant. And I sometimes feel, because very often people will say, well, how many years are you spending on the book? And I often say that I find that a lot of my best insights into the character come in the first year or two of writing, because that's when my senses are most alive. And then there's a certain familiarity that comes into play. And so there's a point of diminishing returns. So I never, the longest I've spent, I guess, was Washington, 6 years, because I feel that you do reach this point of diminishing returns where the person...
Is that because you're in an exploratory phase where you're open to new interpretations about the individual? Is that the reason those first 2 years are so critical?
Yeah, it's kind of like, meeting a new friend. You have a strong reaction. Samuel Beckett said habit is a great deadener, and it's something that you've obviously found ways to counter that, that you've managed to come up, over a sustained period of time. with fresh insights about, Jefferson. But I don't know that I could do that. So there's something to go back to John's very point. Playing the field has its advantages.
Yeah.
So you've played the field with
I think we dropped the metaphor.
well, Roosevelt,
Well, I said promiscuous,
Jackson.
so.
Yes, sir.
Jefferson. You've covered presidents who have passed on to the ages, and Ken mentioned your biography of President Bush,
Right.
Power and Destiny. So you've covered dead figures and a living figure, one who's very much alive.
Very much so.
And not only somebody who's alive, but somebody who you've come to know. I worked with John very briefly at Newsweek years ago, and he had a bust of George H.W. Bush in his office. So you
It was
admired
the
him.
only bust of George H.W. Bush, which is the reason I had it, but yeah.
And then you came to know him
Yeah.
when you were doing the Bible.
Yeah.
So what are the challenges in doing a portrait of a living person?
Well, distance, obviously, the kind of critical distance we're talking about. To me, the most fascinating overall lesson of doing it was I wondered how much I missed in books where I've written where I haven't known the person. Because, I've never had dinner with Thomas Jefferson. I've never had dinner with Andrew Jackson. Having had dinner with George Bush, I would try to write what he was like as a literary matter, and I would know what I was missing.
Right.
And that raised the literary bar rather higher than I would have expected. So seems to me, if you spent time with someone, you are able to judge what you've written and your conclusions by a different standard than what you've gotten out of the papers or you've gotten out of the archives. And so to me, that was a surprise. I expected it to be somewhat easier, frankly, as a literary matter. I mean, go have lunch, write it up, how hard can that be? Well, it turns out it's pretty hard because if your literary skills aren't firing on all pistons at that particular moment, then you're not capturing what he was like. He was a particular challenge, as some people in the audience know well. He is a man, I believe, who became president of the United States because of a quiet, persistent charisma. But charisma is not a word often associated with the 41st president. And so trying to explain how this man, through a very unconventional path, came to hold ultimate authority in a nuclear age was tricky. The other tricky thing was he is so encrusted with all of the popular cultural images about him. I mean, sometimes this was like writing a biography of Dana Carvey.
Yeah.
Not gonna do it, I asked Dana, actually, I said, how did you do the impression? He said, the key to doing George H.W. Bush was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. Absolutely.
About right.
Absolutely right. So you had to get past through that. You had to get past the supermarket scanner. You had to get past the wimp factor. You had all this stuff. And I have found I was out talking about it for 3 or 4 months. And it is interesting. People are at once very nostalgic. We have, if I may just quickly, we have in 25 years moved from a Republican president who could not talk about himself to a Republican. So it's sort of like what Henry Adams said about the movement from Washington to Grant. It disproved Darwin. So that's kind of a critical thing. So people have lived through it. People think they know what they think about him. And so I had to sort of fight against that and make a historical case for him. The rule is sort of 25 years in my mind, the line between journalism and history. And it took that long to I think, to get a view of him, which I happen to think is at least the truest view I could write. I think he's an underrated president who did remarkable things and had enormous political faults, failed in the fundamental political test of a presidency, which is being reelected. But I do believe, and this is an interesting lesson, it seems to me, for this era, is that he did a lot of things wrong on the way to power. But once he had power, he did the right thing at his own political cost. Whether it was he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act when he ran for the Senate down here in 64, but in 68 he votes for open housing. He runs, as you will recall, a not particularly gentle campaign, kinder or gentler, in 1988, but he became the last great kind of compromise president, and read my lips, for which he paid enormously. And we're still living with much of the impact of that split in the Republican Party at that time.
Is it more difficult to critically assess somebody you know, somebody whose family you know, somebody you've come to call a friend?
Sure, it's harder, absolutely. But in my view, you call them as you see them. He made that possible in many ways. This doesn't really, I mean, y'all appreciate this. This doesn't really happen very much. I mean, I can't think of another presidential family that would hand over the presidential diary, the vice presidential diaries, and Mrs. Bush's diary. Mrs. Bush kept a diary, still does, from 1948 forward. When, is he gone? Yeah. When.
We are being taped, just so
Okay,
you know.
all right. I know he's not going to watch it, so that's okay. When President Bush 43 found out that his mother had given me her diary, he went, "She gave you what?" That's not good for me. It was totally fine. And so they gave me, and it was a great deal of trust, and I tried to be worthy of it. I think he lied about Iran-Contra. I think he was wrong on some of the tactics in 1988. I think his fundamental political failure was that he drew a bright line between what you say on the campaign trail and what you do in governance. That was a mistake. He picked up a phrase when he was in China from Mao about firing the empty cannons of rhetoric. He saw he was like the Admiral in Mary Poppins on the campaign trail. He would fire the cannon full of powder, but just expect the noise to carry it. He didn't expect it to carry over. Is that, am I in the tank for him for that? It doesn't seem like that to me, but readers have to judge.
Yeah, I mean, with the Hemmingses, obviously didn't have the original members of the family around, but you have descendants of the family, and you have to, many of whom I'm friendly with and so forth, but as you said, you really do have to call it as you see it, and families have their understandings about their family's motivations, their ancestors, they have an interest in all of that, but as a historian, you really do have to keep your distance in that way and call it as you see it.
Let me ask, you have voluminous letters from Thomas Jefferson, which give you a glimpse into his mind. You have no letters from Sally Hemings.
No.
Where do you start there in that?
Well, you have to write around it. We have letters from her brothers. We have the memory of her son. We have statements from other people. So you have to, figures who don't, when you're piecing together the life of somebody who didn't write anything, you just have to go around it, what other people said about it, and you have to be transparent with the audience. As long as you are clear with the audience about the readers, about what you have and what you don't have, people come along with you in that way, but you can't make stuff up. But it's much harder, and that's why it was easier to do the Hemingses of Monticello rather than Sally Hemings, because there are enough family members, enough things that you could pull together that was known about them that you could actually create a portrait of the family, but not any individual could withstand an entire biography.
Can I just say a point? And the power of Annette's work is that with such a paucity of sources, you feel as though you are right there. And it's an amazing achievement.
Well, thank you, but it's really around it, all of the, you write around it, the era, the time period, and try to evoke as much of it as you can, and you use the little bits you have. There's some things we know about her, but no letters, and that's sort of the life's blood of history. And if you recall that letters are not always right. So if you think that you have this voluminous amount of material about Jefferson, but he's still, to many people, mysterious, because there's still a job to be done in interpretation, even when you have things on the paper, but it's much better to have it than not.
No, it's a real problem because I think any biographer would say, there's a tyranny of words that when you're writing a history, you tend to follow the paper trail, and where the paper trail is richest, you devote the most space. So, particularly, I think for me, the greatest frustration writing about the 18th century, in the 19th century, if there are holes in the story, usually you can fill them. In the 18th century, there are these kind of, black holes. I think of Hamilton's boyhood, even of Washington's boyhood. George Washington's father dies when he's 11. There's exactly one sentence in all of his papers, referring to his father. Hamilton, the entire first third of his life is played out in the Caribbean, where there is scarcely any paper trail at all. Obviously had a tremendous impact on him. And so, there's a temptation to do less about those places just because, as you found with Sally Hemings, because the paper trail is so thin. But I think that it becomes especially incumbent on you to do whatever you can, work whatever sources you can, to at least build the context and the circumstances for what happens. So it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors because you're doing a particular period in the person's life without the person, being always in the foreground of it. But otherwise, you get this situation where particularly, and this is a big problem with presidential biography, where kind of with all of us, when we hit the presidency, we suddenly hit, like the mother lode of all time in terms of paperwork. Mark was telling me before this, I asked how many documents there were in the LBJ library, how many pieces of paper. Anyway, I think it said 45 million.
5 million, yeah.
Even going back with George Washington, in the most recent, to give you some sense of just how abundantly documented presidential lives are, with George Washington, we now have 135,000 documents. Every year they publish another volume or two. They've published about 70 volumes. They're projected 90-plus volumes. Now doing Grant at something called the Grant Presidential Library in Starkville, Mississippi. There are 250,000 documents. And even with that, even with 135,000 with Washington or 250,000 with Grant, I feel like I'm swimming in material. But I really don't know what I would do if I had the resources of one of the modern presidential libraries. And I'm friends with Bob Caron. I know, Bob's, when he was working as a newspaper reporter in the early days, an editor told him, always turn the next page. Well, he's been turning the next page for 40 years now, and it's kind of never ending. And so I think that that's a real problem, that we have done such an extraordinary job of preserving these presidencies that we threaten to overwhelm rather than inspire all future biographers, because it becomes more difficult to sort of make sense of it. And I'll just say one last thing. I think what's happened, because of in the earlier period, in the founding era, where you have these gigantic editions of papers that can be anywhere from 50 to 90 volumes. And then with the modern presidential library starting, was Hoover the first or FDR?
Yeah.
Was it with Hoover? Where you get in millions or tens of millions of documents. I think that what has happened is it's had a perverse effect that the biographers actually become less ambitious. Because to do an old-fashioned cradle-to-grave biography, people look at, the already 70 volumes of George Washington and say, oh, you mean to do an authoritative one-life volume of Washington, I have to, master 70 volumes, and of course, that's just the starting point. So I think that that's a problem that we really haven't figured out. But can I ask you a question, Mark, even though you're the moderator, because you're the one who's really close to this problem? What should biographers do when there is such an immensity of material and well cataloged and classified available?
One of the challenges that you have with the modern presidency is the Freedom of Information Act, where people can file requests, so that you have, after Reagan You have libraries processing records not through a proactive agenda, but reactively to the requests that they get. So it's very difficult sometimes to get the material you really want as a biographer.
Yeah.
So sometimes that's not a problem. You know, I'm at the Johnson Library, and you know, you have so many aspects of that presidency that are still germane today, and I think we see frequently researchers delve into papers relating to civil rights or for education and so forth. And most of those are available, but Johnson's so hard to put your arms around because his legacy is so vast. And so I see more and more specialization of Johnson, with the exception of Caro, who's devoted more of his adult life to covering Johnson as a biographer than Johnson did living it. It's a remarkable thing.
But I think you're right, Mark. I think what has happened is, you know, faced with the immensity of material, that people opt to do a moment in the life, you know, a theme or an episode. And that's fine. Of course, the resources are tremendous. But there's also something about, you know, seeing an entire life between two covers in terms of, you know, rendering an assessment of this person that is kind of lovely to read, if not to write.
And I would also argue that perhaps current events suggest that history may have a great deal to say to us about how to move forward, if not as a GPS, at least as a diagnostic guide. So I would argue that the enterprise itself has rarely been more important.
We'll take questions in one moment, so if you'd start queuing up to the mics. Let me ask Ron, has the phenomenal success of Hamilton made you approach biography any differently than you had prior to getting involved on the project?
I'm not writing in rhymed couplets. It's funny, I was thinking when they performed the opening number of the show, I have repeatedly told Lin-Manuel Miranda that I would like to perform just once the opening number. For some reason, he's not taken me up on that. I was thinking tonight was really my chance. I mean, the Pulitzer committee really blew it. They could have asked me to do it, and I would have been thrilled. I could have died a happy man, you know, having done the opening.
There's still time.
Number of No, you know, it's been very interesting working with Lin, because I remember when I started working with him, he came over to my house just a few months after I met him, and he sat down on my living room couch and he started snapping his fingers, and he said, "How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman drop," see, I'm going to do it, "in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by Providence." Anyway, he did the whole, you know, first song. Changed my image, changed my life. But when he finished singing the song, he said to me, "What do you think?" I said, "I think it's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. You've condensed the first 40 pages of my book accurately into a 4.5-minute song." But what I didn't say to Lin, but what I certainly was thinking was, "Pal, either you write very tight or I write very long." And so it's been interesting because his powers of compression are absolutely fantastic. There is an epilogue in the show, which is very similar to my epilogue in the book, where you suddenly jump forward in time and you have Eliza as a widow. And I could remember, because Lin didn't do that until the very end, you wrote that scene. And I was thinking, how do you even kind of fast forward that way in a show so many years? And he has, Eliza comes out and she has this beautiful couplet, "I stop wasting time on tears, I live another 50 years. It's perfect. Like that quickly, he manages to not only establish the passage of time, but establish her attitude toward the passage of time. So I actually kind of learned a lot watching him in terms of he has an absolutely uncanny ability to pluck the essence out of a character, a relationship, or a situation. So I find sometimes when writing Grant, I would kind of think, what would Lin pull out of this particular episode? It's still going to be, an 800 or 900 page book. I seem to be incorrigible about the length, but it was a very, very useful exercise to work with someone who was a master of distillation in that way.
One final question before we go to the audience questions, and a quick question for each of you. You have somebody ready to carve another portrait on Mount Rushmore. Who should it be?
Annette?
Why do you start with me?
This means, Annette, you're going to have to leave Monticello.
Wow, that's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
I don't know about carving people on Mount Rushmore.
Good point.
I'd put FDR and Eleanor.
A twofer.
Created modern America.
Well, I think that would, and if I had to pick people, yeah, that makes sense. If
I think
if
Jackson
one must
would be a little
have
unpopular, but
what?
I don't think
No,
I can do Jackson.
no, can't do
What
that.
about you, Ron?
I'm tempted to say Grant. I know, pre-publication of the book, that's going to seem like a very big stretch to most of the people in the audience. But I will say this, Americans, probably the single most written about and read about period of American history is the Civil War. But Americans are shockingly ignorant of Reconstruction and what happened in Reconstruction. And you can't understand the Civil War without understanding Reconstruction. And you can't understand modern American politics without understanding what happened, with Reconstruction. And Grant was the figure, really, he was the figure after Lincoln died who really kind of straddled those two worlds, the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I remember when I started the book reading, Sean Willen said that between Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson, the single most important figure to the African-American community was Ulysses S. Grant. And that, as I've been doing the research, has been overwhelmingly, that insight is overwhelmingly vindicated.
Right. Talmadge?
Yeah. It seems like presidential biographies are so much more important and better received and better sold than biographies of any other Americans.
Yeah.
And the people on Mount Rushmore have obviously been well covered, and the people who are on our money, Franklin Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, are well covered. As you think about your next book, of course, Ron, you've thought about Grant, and John, you're thinking about your next book. Is there a temptation to pull a David McCulloch and pull a John Adams and pull a Harry Truman or a Carroll, pull an LBJ, Amity Shlaes, pull a Coolidge and try to elevate them and become their advocate to give them more significance and prove that there's all kinds of reasons why they belong up there? Is there that temptation as you evaluate your next book?
And to talk about your next book, if you
Well, yeah, there's a temptation to circle all the way back, to find, is there a place in the is there someone in the conversation who is not there who should be, is the way I would put it, I guess. I guess it's not my job, I don't see it as part of my task to get people on Rushmore or get them memorialized. As I say, if I write about you, you tend to get thrown off the currency. So maybe bad news may not be good news for anybody that I'm writing about them. But I'm pretty close to deciding to write about Dolly and James Madison. And part of it is that Madison is one of the most important Americans of the early republic who, honestly, I still have a hard time imagining what it would be like to sit down and have dinner with him. Mm-hmm. And one of the points of biography is to bring a life back into being. Mrs. Madison helps enormously there, obviously, because you can sort of imagine that. Mm-hmm. To me, it's an interesting mountain to climb because he had to, I just believe this, and even in the democratic, lowercase d, politics of the early republic, you had to be able to impress your personality on enough people mm-hmm. in a significant enough way that James Madison had to do that. And to be a two-term president, to have been Secretary of State, to have been such a critical figure of the Constitutional Convention, if you read, Ron alluded to, when you read contemporary descriptions of someone like Madison, you don't come away thinking, that's the guy I want to go fishing with. But I think part of the mission, if I do this, is going to be figuring out what was it about him. This is true of the Bush book. Mm-hmm. What was it about him that put him in ultimate authority? And then what did he do with it? So yes, I mean, it is, you do want to find someone, it seems to me you want to find someone, I think Grant is, I think I'm not being presumptuous, Grant has not had, a Chernow in a long time. Lincoln gets a lot of folks, FDR gets a lot of folks, Kennedy gets a lot of folks. And so that is part of my thinking. Less to figure out a way to celebrate them, but I do believe in recovering them.
You put it so well, I'm not going to add this.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'm going to ask one little one to Ron Chernow, because I love the George Washington book, and I know how much research you did on that. And I was reading a Henry Cabot Lodge 2-volume biography on Washington, and it begins with an explanation of his funeral and the effect it was having in France and England, and how he was honored in those two countries. Is that true?
Yeah, it's interesting that George Washington has really had a tremendous worldwide reputation. And even, it was very interesting to me when the book was published in England. I didn't exactly know what the reception was. And the gist of so many of the reviews was, number one, extraordinary admiration that they have for Washington. Two, that they had terribly mismanaged the relationship. Here, Washington was a raging Anglophile, coveted a commission in the regular army. He could so easily have been co-opted into this, global military machine that the British had, and they didn't. And so I think that George Washington, like Abraham Lincoln, is a figure who has become kind of universal figure. I think that is true.
Yes, sir.
Yes, so you guys write biographies for presidents, and in the last few decades, the presidents themselves, sometimes they write their own autobiographies, including Bill Clinton. And these days, all the presidential candidates, they tend to write their own autobiographies, and obviously some of them will become president.
Right.
So my question is, how would you compare your works to the autobiographies they write for themselves?
Let me say one thing, at least on the candidates' books, we're pretty sure they haven't written them, and we're not even sure they've read them in some cases.
No, I had this, when I started working on Grant. Grant, of course, published very famous memoirs. And a couple of months after I was working on the book, I ran into a friend on the street who said to me, Ron, how do you write a great biography of somebody who has written a great autobiography? And I have to say that the question stopped me dead in my tracks. It just haunted me, for weeks afterwards. Of course, there are some small omissions in Grant's memoirs. For instance, no mention of his two-term presidency. Small things like that were omitted. But basically, I realized, because it made me go back to his memoirs and read them differently, because I realized that what my job was as a biographer was to talk about everything he didn't want to talk about, so that, in the 1850s, he failed at one business venture after another, to the point that he was reduced to selling firewood on the street corners of St. Louis. Well, that kind of miserable 4-year period of his life is skipped over in his memoirs in 2 sentences. And so it was actually kind of useful to go back and to realize that, of course, when people write their memoirs, no matter how candid they appear to be, kind of covering a whole world of, failure and misery, and emphasizing quite understandably, what they want history to remember them about. But that's kind of quite different from the job of presumably more objective biographer studying their life.
Jefferson started an autobiography and ends it when he comes back from France, and he says he's bored talking about himself. And it was strictly a statement about his public life, because he didn't think that people should talk about your private life. Someone asked him to give him the names of his grandchildren, and he said, why would people want to know what my children's grandchildren's, no, they would be bored by that kind of thing. So it's exactly as you say, you want to tell the stories of the things that people didn't want to say, or people, you know, we don't see ourselves, our vision of ourselves is not the only thing. You remember I talked about his sort of terse rendition of the story of Burl. It's the people around him who actually give a picture of who this person was, who we are. We don't see ourselves in the same light as the people around us. So that's what biographers bring to the mix, everything, not just the individual's perspective.
We're about to time out, but Annette will give you the last word. We've heard about Ron's next book about Ulysses S. Grant. We've heard about John's next book on James and Dolly Madison. Talk about your next project.
My next project, after the last biography of Jefferson, the thematic biography, I'm going back to the Hemings family. I'm working on another volume of that, and then I'm going to do a 2-volume biography of Jefferson.
Well, we look forward to that.
He says 3.
It's going to be 3.
We look forward to that as we look forward to Ron's and John's book. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and mostly to thank our panelists for a wonderful and enlightening panel. Thank you so much. Well done. Well done, as always.
Thank you very much. It's great.
Well done, Annette. Pleasure. Nicely done, Ron.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just a couple of quick announcements before everybody bolts, please. Just to remind you that in a few minutes, all 3 of our biographers here will be signing their books in the Institute lobby. Their books are available for purchase right outside the auditorium. So on behalf of the working committee here on this event, I'd like to thank you for sharing your evening with us. And just a quick reminder that our program starts promptly tomorrow at 9 a.m. You can enter through the Institute doors on this side of the building tomorrow. We have a very packed day. The doors will open at 8, so you can be seated and comfortable by the time the program starts. So that's it for this evening. Please drive safely. We look forward to seeing you at 8. Good night.